What happens when a government does housing reform? Well, there's a lesson here in the hammer and in this bag of milk. Confused? Well, don't worry, you're not alone. So are municipal governments, citizens and developers of Ontario. Ontario has been pumping out legislative changes like a shotgun in a mall in a country where buying guns is a hobby. Bill 108, 109, 3, 23 and 39 all take aim at low housing supply.
This provincial prying is happening because housing supply has been falling further and further behind demand. And the problem is the collective failure of municipal governments. Local voters didn't want neighbourhood densification, and so they did their own research and got themselves a doctorate from No House for You. These folks, both young but often old, will tell you the proposed housing is too tall, doesn't have enough affordable units in it, doesn't fit in, is all owned by Chinamen, and was the site of an historic boardwalk under which they were once having fun.
Under the boardwalk, boardwalk.
But I'll tell you who wasn't having fun. Western civilization. Beholden to mortgages and skyrocketing rents that a decade of underbuilding has caused, many people in the world's most affluent countries spend their lives working long hours in dumb but stable jobs to pay for a requirement for life that sits alongside water, food, and clothes on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So higher levels of government around the world are starting to intervene.
But is what's happening in Ontario going to address this? That's why I'm here. Because as Ontario stumbles out of the blocks, we're getting a glimpse at what might be coming to your state, province, or country in the near future. So today, let's look at the headliner, Bill 23. Now, Bill 23 in Ontario is an omnibus bill, meaning it gets not only its fingers, but a full-on palm into all of the pies and really gives them a good sticky squeeze. One fruit-filled civic crust it doesn't touch is the Greenbelt. People criticizing Bill 23 often mix the separate amendments to the Greenbelt plan. But while the Greenbelt amendments get 3 thumbs down from me and discussed in another video, Bill 23 is overall a thumbs up.
Some environmental concerns in Bill 23 are valid. It does make it easier to develop land that comes out of a greenbelt. But I've found in the public discourse, many of the environmental issues on this bill stem from confusion with what actually ended up in it.
For example, site plans. Site planning is the process where a city like Hamilton assesses things around a building, like landscaping and drainage. Bill 23 removes this from smaller developments of up to 10 units and eliminated exterior design altogether on developments with affordable housing units. But there was an oversight when the bill was first proposed. Exteriors aren't just pretty things, they're also where your insulation goes. And in good old cold Canada, insulation isn't in the nice to haves column. The massive cumulative costs of inefficient buildings is absolutely one of the things that developers try to slip past uninformed consumers who don't calculate the large lifetime ownership numbers. However, based on feedback from cities, this was amended and environmental construction standards and sustainable design were restored. But because a lot of the reporting was about the first version of the bill, articles still float around with misconceptions about inefficient exteriors. Now, there are some environmental downsides to Bill 23, but on balance, I'd say there are overall more substantive environmental positives in it. Because the site plans are just one of many amendments that make it easier to build medium density than before. And the cost, it might be uglier, because as I've covered in a previous video, the people reviewing this are not usually you and your neighbors, they're architects and planning professionals. And their idea of beauty is, well, consider how many buildings people complain about today were built under this system.
Plenty of stuff that this site plan system has signed off on isn't my cup of tea, but I'm still glad a home exists under the ugly facade. The worst form of housing going up around here is tents. Those are a deeper ugliness, because it makes our national myth look like the facade.
And you may be thinking, I don't care. I'm not burdening our descendants with the legacy of ugly buildings. They'll be glad the poor slept in tents when they see this beautiful brickwork. I'm off to City Hall to give them the good old NIMB. Why? Because you're doing something I don't like across the street. Well, not so fast. Another part of Bill 23 made that a whole lot harder.
Third-party appeals have been removed from minor variances and draft plans to divide lots. A third-party appeal is basically your nosy neighbor suing you at property court to stop something from occurring. Say you want to build 90 centimeters closer to the front of a lot, or take an existing property, divide it into two and build two houses. Well, these are things you can do now without some rando deciding to fuck up your whole plan with a $400 appeal that would delay your project by months.
It's completely visible to the rest of the neighborhood, anybody on the street, anybody on the sidewalk.
Who cares? That has nothing to do with you.
Variances are very common and a necessary part of housing. They're the flexibility of implementation, and as projects grow in size, the likeliness of wanting to remove some parking or exceed the height limit for some section of the building increases.
Removing this landmine is one of many things in the bill that make it easier and less risky to build. Bill 23 is a real mixed bag though. When it passed, it felt a little bit like that moment in Storage Wars, you know, where the crowd of characters come and bid on the contents of a shipping container from sight only. It looks like a mess because it is. We'll only really know the impact of all this in decades. And the people that are very certain about what's going to happen and who's going to benefit, I don't trust them.
Aluminum table. This thing's worth about $1,200.
I talked to a lot of people researching Bill 23, and one clear trend emerged. The people who were the most certain about what the bill means were the most political and the first to crumble under specific questioning, revealing that they didn't actually know what was in it. On the other hand, the more technocratic people with the greatest knowledge of the legislation were much more likely to humbly say they just didn't know yet. What will end up coming from these bills involves complicated interplays between citizens, developers, municipalities, and markets, and the smart money knows that this rests on the interpretation and implementation over the next decade. To illustrate this, let's take one of the more interesting parts of Bill 23. There is now a province-wide right to have 3 units on one residential lot. Either 2 units in a main structure with an ancillary laneway house, or the simplest implementation, just 3 units in a main building. A triplex. R1 zoning is the standard one house per lot zoning, which we see across all of North America. It's your suburbia zoning. And the largest province of Canada ended it. Actually, not only ended it, but bumped it up to 3 units with little to no fanfare. So now in Ontario, you have the right to build 3 units on any residential lot at the same time as dividing lots just got easier. The mind boggles at what this could mean, but could is the word.
We're at a bag of milk moment in housing. The law is passed. Now is interpretation and implementation time. When the Canadian federal government hit the public with metrification in the 1970s, food producers had to react. Production lines made for gallon jugs were suddenly illegal, but the machines that made bagged milk, well, they could be adjusted to metric units with a simple reconfiguration. So milk producers in Canada shifted over to bags, and in Eastern Canada, it still persists for various reasons, even though the federal laws have long since been relaxed.
It's unlikely that the feds intended for generations of Canadians to suck on sex, that's how I do it, but at some point a group of bureaucrats and milk producers decided to interpret that milk bags were a valid solution, and that still just works for many people to this day. Bill 23 has a lot of interpretation to it, and there are many good things that could come of it.
Housing advocates inside and outside of government have been pushing plexus for decades in North America, but local politicians don't want to take the flak for delivering that vote loser to suburban voters. Local politicians can use the cover and say, hey, it wasn't us, this is provincial regulation. You can even see it in the City of Toronto's staff interpretation of the bill that some think it says plexus. And why not? I mean, doesn't it have to be? How else are you supposed to guarantee 3 reasonable sized units on any lot? But there is also some precedent for how this bill could fail, because this is not the first time that the provincial government has taken a swing at housing problems. Bill 109 was passed in early 2022, and one section targeted the increasingly long approvals time for housing with a pretty heavy-handed strategy. The bill set a time limit on municipal governments to do their job, after which they had to refund the developers for fees on their approvals. Now, meeting this law was also down to interpretation and implementation. Municipalities could hire staff, focus on worst offenders, or streamline processes. The provincial government didn't really care how they did it, just get those stamps stamping. What they probably didn't expect was what Hamilton interpreted. In Hamilton, a formal consultation has long existed for project approval. This is a consultation with the city before doing a project, where they make sure you fill in the right forms and submit the correct paperwork. It's a sensible system that reduces wasted time down the road. You pay a modest amount for this consultation, but it's credited towards the real project fees once things get underway. Hamilton hired some management consultants to look at the law and come up with a plan. They indeed found the city on many projects far exceeds the mandated time in Bill 109, putting at risk substantial amounts of future fee revenues. Hamilton was exactly the sort of city that this was targeted at, but the solution they came up with, they hiked the formal consultation fees from $1,260 to $8,840. So sorry about the delays, Mr. Developer. We had some problems with availability of council committee meeting times, e.g. summer. It's actually in it. Sorry about that, bud. We're all up at the lake. Anyway, guess we now have to refund your money for your zoning bylaw amendment. So that'll be, go fuck yourself, bud. You didn't pay a fee. You bought a non-refundable municipal meeting gift card. There's a lot more to Bill 23 in Powell's than what I've talked about today, but Hamilton shows how much of what happens is ultimately down to city staff and politicians getting on board. Will Hamilton be standardizing triplexes across the city, or dragging its feet by only effectively letting people build a shed with a letterbox in their backyard? We'll only know in a decade if they seized the scapegoat and turned it into new housing supply, or if when the biggest shake-up in housing in a generation arrived, they spitefully gave the province's progressive conservative provincial government an even more conservative implementation. What happens when a government does housing reform? Well, there's a lesson here in the hammer and this bag of milk. I forgot to bring the props. What happens, I'm gonna drop this for sure though, and in this bag of milk. Okay, at least I didn't drop it, you know? There's a lesson here in the hammer and in this bag of milk. Well, there's a lesson here in the hammer and in this bag of milk, which I caught successfully. Yeah! That's the aiming part, right? Not bad. This is the aiming. It's definitely some milk leakage going on now. Yeah. Woo! Drop my milk.